our mission today is to prove traditional economics wrong. So I'm sure you guys have heard of like economic class, and then there's AP economics, macroeconomics, there's economic models that we use in college, but today our job is to prove that traditional economics, traditional data is partly flawed, because when we bring in behavior economics, it kind of overturns the table. So that is our goal today. So now I want you guys to look at this. Okay, so that 1996 with 92-point rate from the Wine Advocate magazine, the finest La Japelaise since 1990, and there's only 8,100 cases made in the world. Okay, how much would you pay for this wine? So the real price of this wine actually is not very relevant in the lesson, but it's around $200. For those of us who don't know that much about wines, we have no clue what they're worth. And if we tell you, okay, it's around $5,000, you'll believe it. If I say it's 50K, you probably will think it's overpriced. But if I say it's $50, you probably will also believe it. So, but that number I gave to you guys, I told you that we're saving it for later, another game. So in here, now, does this seem very logical to you guys? That the number given, saying that there's no correlation, is actually very closely correlated to your gas price. So this is a very similar experiment to a experiment conducted in MIT for MIT students in the book that we're going to be based off of. We're introducing the concept we're talking about called a bear tree coherence. I'll explain this chart later. So a bear tree, what does this word mean? A bear tree means random, chance, right? The email I sent you guys, it is totally a random number that I just came up with. That is what a bear tree means. Coherence came from the word coherent. What does coherent mean? Coherent means logical, reason, right? So a bear tree coherence means random for reason. So predictably irrational. Irrational is random. Predictably is logical. So a bear tree coherence is a huge factor in behavioral economics. So randomness causes reasoning. The number is random. So this chart is actually the results of assessing 1,000 MIT students. So as you can see, the top column is the last 2 digits of their social security number. So if your last 2 digits, your social security number is between 1 and 19, or 40 to 59, or 80 to 99, the professor has asked the students how much you would pay for each of these items. So cordless trackball, cordless keyboard, also the 1999 Hermitage. And as you can see, as the last 2 digits go up, so of course, the professor asked the students to first, okay, think about your number, right? Think about your social security number and then estimate the price. So that largely influenced their decision on how much prices are willing to pay. And as you can see, right, as their digit grew bigger, the average price that they're willing to pay gets bigger. It gets bigger. It gets bigger. So does that seem rational? Logical? What does rational mean? Does it seem logical? Of course not. But that's the way we think. And before I explain more onto this experiment, we'll come back to this. I want you guys to hear about a Gosling example. Okay, so this is a Gosling, right? So the Gosling, a biologist, so Conrad Lorenz, he discovered that Gosling, so these animals, upon breaking out of their eggs, so when they're born, they become attached to the first moving object they encounter, is usually their mother. So they first see their mother and they will
follow the
mother everywhere. And then this is what Lawrence called a natural phenomenon called imprinting. So the first impression give you a very strong impression. So that's why it's called imprinting. So if we were to go back to behavior economics, this Gosling example set a very good explanation for the wine that you guys have guessed. So that number set a unconscious imprint in your mind that gave you a relative value to the decision you're about to make next, right? Connecting to relativity, yesterday we learned before. So back to this example. After all, so we may just be goslings. So although the willingness to pay for these items was arbitrary, right? It was very random. There's also a logical side, which is the coherent aspect to it. The logical, which means, okay, we have an imprint already. When we look at the bids for the two pair of related items, let's say the two wines or the two computer components, so the two wines right here, or the two computer components right here, the relative price seems incredibly logical. Everyone is willing to pay more for a keyboard than a trackball, right? We're able to, trackball means basically a mouse, right? We're willing to pay more for a keyboard than a trackball. So the significance to this, that once participants are willing to pay a certain price for one product, their willingness to pay for other items in the same product category is judged relatively to the first price. So we already learned about arbitrary coherence, like your first impression of your social security number or the number I emailed to you guys. But when we look at prices at similar category, we tend to find relative within them. But that's all unconscious, right? We don't think, okay, so trackball and keyboard are both related to computer. Now they might have a similar price range. We don't think that. It's largely unconscious. So that is another connection. So that is arbitrary coherence. So before we want to prove the wrong of traditional economics, I want to introduce to you guys what is traditional economics and what we need to learn before we prove it wrong. Okay, so if we were to start up economics supply and demand chart. Okay, so when we look at an economic supply and demand chart, you see this graph, right? What this is telling you, okay, I press visit. Okay, so we see this image, right? We have the y-axis, the x-axis, and it's labeled, this represents the price, right? Price goes higher, this quantity goes higher. Now S represents supply and this represents demand. So I'll type it so it's easier. So this is supply, this is demand. Does anyone need me to explain what supply and demand are? Basically, supply is what factories produce, what they're selling you, and demand is what we want, right? We're demanding something from other people, from businesses, let's say. So let's look at demand alone. As the price increase, the demand decrease, the quantity demanded decrease. Now that seems very rational, right? The more expensive this book cost, the less people are going to buy it because it's going to ration out a portion of the consumers. Now that makes sense, right? But what if we were to look at supply? As the price increase, quantity increases. What does that mean? As the price of the book increase, the producers are able to produce more, therefore supply more for the consumers. So that is part of traditional economics, that demand and supply are drawn separately on the graph, and they have individual factors which determine them. Now let's go back to behavior economics. I'm going to pass the mic to Talal, who's going to tell you a story on the Black Pearl example.
Okay, so a lot of you may be a bit confused on all of the huge kind of concepts we just threw out there. But this example is a bit more concrete and it may help to kind of establish your understanding a little bit more. So in 1973, a man by the name of James Azeo was an Italian diamond dealer, and he bought a piece of land that had a lot of these Tahitian black pearls. And like anyone would, he wanted to find some use for them, and he wanted to sell them to people who wanted them so he could hopefully get some money going, make some sort of use of them. And after a year, he failed miserably because nobody wanted to buy them. And I can understand why as well, because at the time, what happened was he failed miserably after trying to sell them for a year, and nobody wanted to buy them. So he tried to switch up his strategy, and he reached out to a friend who was a jeweler and he cashed in on a favor. And he asked a friend for two things. He asked a friend to put an absurdly high price on the pearls, and he also asked a friend to put the pearls on the same shelves that he sold the diamonds and emeralds and all the other rare metals of the world. And by doing this, people started buying the pearls in droves, and so many more people started buying them. And what we can take from this example is two main concepts. The first one is tying back to what Reina covered earlier, which is the idea of anchors and the Gosling's example. So in this example, the consumers that went to the store or the jeweler shop, they would look at the diamonds and they would have that imprint where they would understand that something is extraordinary or something really valuable. And because they got imprinted with that idea from the diamond at first, it carried over to the pearls when they looked at the pearls on the same shelf. And that's why a lot more people were drawn towards buying the pearls as well, which is a really good tactic that a lot of businesses use today. The second idea is pertaining more to the supply and demand that we covered earlier, and it's more within our human nature. So nobody who bought the pearls actually bought the pearls because they wanted the pearls. They bought the pearls because they wanted something that was hard to achieve or something that was hard to acquire. Because when the pearls were fairly cheap and the guy was selling them for a relatively fair price, nobody wanted them. The second he made them absurdly expensive and placed them besides the diamonds and the rare metals, everyone wanted to buy them. So this shows us that in our human nature, we're generally drawn towards things that are hard to achieve or hard to acquire. And that shows us that if we don't understand these aspects of our human nature, then it's really easy to misunderstand a lot of the things that go into supply and demand, the dynamic. And if we don't understand the way we shift within our intentions and our human nature, it's going to be a lot harder to follow along those dynamic shifts as well later on.
Just to add on, I think it's very well explained how Talal said, okay, we are carrying our imprint of other things to products such as the black pearl. And why is this contradicting the traditional economics? If we were to go back to this, right? As the price increase for the pearls, the demand should decrease. But as Talal explained, we increase the black pearls to such a high price just by placing it, let's say, in the window of Fifth Avenue. And the demand actually surged. It went right up. Now, this is not because of price. It's because of using other human behaviors. So this graph is also proven wrong in this scenario. So next, we want to use another example to emphasize this idea of imprint, okay? So now we're not going to be talking about physical product such as jewelries. I'm gonna introduce you to an experiment that was conducted also at MIT by Dan Ariely. So he asked his entire class, half of the students, to write down whether they would be willing to pay him $10 to listen to a 10-minute poetry. And he asked the other half of the class, say, would if they will listen to him if he paid them $10. So we have group A and group B. Group A is asked to listen. Group B is asked if they will pay to listen. So this initial question plays a huge role. So we call this the anchor, right? Or the initial imprint. So this is your question. Now, it's not a number, it is the question that is the imprint. So now we can see the result, right? You can see the chart here. Group A gets paid, or willing to, okay, you can pay me $1.30 for a short poem, I'll listen. You have to pay me $270, I'll listen to a medium poem. You have to pay me $4.80 for a longer poem. But then group B, with their initial imprint, it says, okay, I will pay you $1 to hear. I will pay you $2 to hear. I will pay you $3 to hear a long poem. Now, this is an average. Amy, would you like to further explain this?
Yes. So in the beginning, Dan Ariely actually gave his MIT students a hypothetical example. So hypothetically, if I pay you $10, would you listen to me recite a poem? And hypothetically, would you pay me 10? And they're not actually doing it, it's just a hypothetical answer. But when they were actually asked to say, well, you paid this much to do this, how much will you be willing to pay? Not hypothetically, but in reality. Then the students answered, and the students who received each hypothetical situation actually responded with those hypothetical. One is getting paid and one is paying to the exact same thing.
Yes, and this again can help explain what arbitrary coherence is. The initial prices, the $10, is largely arbitrary, right? It's very random and can influence by responses to random questions. But once these prices are established in our mind, it will shape how we want to pay or get paid for a specific item. For example, this is random, right? But this is not. This is logical because you are based off of the initial randomness, get paid or to pay for. So this is very interesting. So one way how you can apply this to real life is if you want something from someone, state the positive side. If I want you to hear me reading a poem, should I say, okay, would you hear me read a poem for $5? Or I should say, I'll read you a poem for $5. Like, it's just how you word it. All right.
Yeah, I wanted to add, so it's also important to understand like where the anchor actually is. And I think both Amy and Rena mentioned that it's within the question. So because he worded it in a way saying like, how much would you pay me to recite my poem? The people who heard that type of the question, they didn't even consider that they could be asking for some sort of compensation or vice versa. So because you word it in some way, it kind of blocks off the entire negative form of thinking. And that's what Reina was saying, where you can like use it to your advantage and get a lot more things to go your way in life as well.
Completely. All right, so that is the poem example. Next, the Starbucks versus Dunkin' example. This is a very fun one. So have you guys ever wondered why Starbucks was so successful when there's much cheaper coffee elsewhere? Okay, so let's talk about this, right? Before I go into Starbucks, the history of it, how it was able to get here today, I'm gonna give you guys a little theory of, let's just use a restaurant first. So let's say you're walking past a restaurant and you see two people standing in the line waiting to get in. You thought to yourself, this must be a good restaurant. People are lining in line. So you stand behind those people. Another person walks by, he sees three people in line standing in the line and think, okay, this must be a fantastic restaurant, and joins the line, and then others join, right? We call this behavior called herding, right? We tend to follow what other people do. And the other people, the people in front of you, they give you the imprint of the good impression of the restaurant before you even try it. And if we were to link back to relativity, right? Other people like it, you might be able to relate to them and also enjoy the food. It happens when we assume that something is good or bad on the basis of other people's previous behaviors, and our own actions will follow. So, but there's another kind of herding. So we talked about one kind of herding, following other people. Another kind of herding is one that we call self-herding. So this happens when we believe that something is good or bad on the basis of our own previous behavior. Essentially, once we become the first person in line at that restaurant, we begin to line up behind ourselves. So if you enjoyed watching TikTok, you will continue go back and go watch TikTok, and you become the next person in line as a customer for TikTok, kind of like that. So let me explain using Starbucks. So think about your first introduction to Starbucks. Perhaps it was several years ago. Like when I was in America, my first impression of Starbucks was that a lot of people carry Starbucks in my school. And then my parents never brought me to Starbucks because they thought, you know, Dunkin' was good enough, etc. Or you can make your own drinks at home. So for example, you are sleepy and in desperate need of a liquid energy boost. And as you embark on an errand one afternoon, you look through the window of Starbucks and you walk in. The prices of the coffees was a shock, right? It's like $5 for a drink. And you've been drinking your entire life at like Dunkin' for years. But since you walked in and now you're curious about what the coffee is, at this price, you might taste the coffee. And you surprised and you get surprised because Starbucks, they have better quality coffee, they have better design, the overall surrounding area is more peaceful. So now you like Starbucks. And the following week, you walk by Starbucks again. You ask yourself, should I go in? The ideal decision-making process should take you into account of the quality of the coffee, right? Starbucks versus Dunkin'. The price are two different places. And of course, the cost of walking a few more blocks for a Dunkin'. So this is a very complex way of thinking. So instead, you just think, okay, I went to Starbucks last time and I enjoyed the coffee, so it must be a good decision for me. So you walk in again to get a coffee. In doing so, you became the second person in line standing behind yourself. And yeah, a few days later, you walk in again and again and again. Voila, you become addicted, you become a loyal customer to Starbucks.
And also you're used to that anchor because you purchase so many times that you think the price is normal. But if you compare your mindset now to when you first encounter Starbucks where the price is a shock, your anchor have changed.
Okay, so, but the story doesn't end here, right? Now you have gotten used to paying more for the coffee than compared to Dunkin'. Yeah, and then you bump yourself up into a new curve of consumption. Other chances might also become simpler. Perhaps now you're going to move from a small coffee, which costs $2, to a medium size, and then to a venti, and then to an extra venti, like if that's a thing. And then even though you don't know how you got yourself into this price bracket in the first place, price range in the first place, moving into a larger coffee at a relatively greater price seems pretty logical, right? You're getting a price for a larger coffee. This is lateral move to the other offerings at Starbucks. There's Cafe Americano, Cafe Mezcino, Macchiato, Frappuccinos, whatever. And if you stop to think about this, it will not be clear whether you should be spending all the money on coffee at Starbucks instead of getting cheaper at Dunkin'. So, but you don't think about these trade-offs anymore. You're already made decisions so many times. So you assume that this is how you want to spend your money. So you're hurting yourself. That is basically the example on self-hurting. However, in listening to this story, there is something odd. So if anchoring is based on our initial decision, how did Starbucks manage to become the initial decision in the first place when we already have an initial decision to a place like Dunkin'? In other words, if we were previously anchored to the prices at Dunkin' Donuts, how did we move our anchor to Starbucks? Now this where it gets really, really interesting. So the founder of Starbucks, Howard Schultz, created Starbucks. He was he was as intuitive a businessman as the person who did the Black Pearl I'll talk about. So he worked diligently to separate Starbucks from the rest of the coffee shops, for example, Dunkin' Donuts, not only through price, but through ambience. Accordingly, he designed Starbucks from the very beginning to feel like a continental coffee house. So the early shops are fragrant with smell of roasted beans. So when you walk into Starbucks, you smell the coffee bean, right? And then Starbucks, obviously, they do have better quality roasted beans than those at Dunkin'. And they were also sold in French, like very fancy French coffee presses. So when you go to Starbucks, when they make the coffee, it's like a very fancy, fully metal coffee press. And then the showcase presented very alluring snacks like almond croissants or biscotti raspberry poussard pastries, or some fancy name, and then displayed in small amounts in the front. When you go look at Dunkin's, right, you see a row of donuts behind the cashier, and they say, okay, which one do you want, right? And then they also, whereas Dunkin' Donuts, they just did like small, medium, large coffees, Starbucks took a turn. They did the short, tall, grande, and venti, as well as the drinks with like more fancy names like cafe americano, cafe misto, or macchiato or frappuccino, that it's very different name, but those are introduced by Starbucks. So the thing is, Starbucks did everything in its power to make the experience feel different. So different, then we're not using the price difference, we're using the experience different. So instead of trying to change the anchor from Starbucks to, Dunkin' to Starbucks, they created a new anchor that Starbucks is preparing us for. And that is how Starbucks succeeded. The new anchor they created for the coffee industry of not just the price or the product, but the overall experience. And you guys were right on that. We have the prestige, the customization, the name, the aesthetic, the environment, also the price also play a part of prestige. But they were able to make their brand like that.
Starbucks also has a good example of the topic we covered yesterday in terms of relativity. Because when people first made the switch from Dunkin', which is pretty cheap, to Starbucks, then it may seem really expensive, but by having those extra options of like venti and those more expensive options, you can compare it to that, and people are more likely to pay more compared to Dunkin'. But in comparison to other sizes and other items that are at Starbucks, it looks pretty cheap, which is why people are much more inclined to go to Starbucks.
Yeah, that is such a good connection to the class yesterday, because people are not comparing Starbucks with Dunkin'. They are opening a new anchor. All right, next slide. So does this seem all rational? It is not rational.
Wants, happiness, rationality, and how these three correlate with one another. So as you guys heard from my colleagues, you guys heard the difference between wants and rationality and how they affect us, but how do they correlate with one another? So this idea can be summed up by knowing that when you want something that is irrational, your mind looks for an external opinion to validate that want, and therefore that opinion makes it rational to you. In other words, if something backs up a choice or an opinion that you have, then it must be a good choice and you are right for going with that choice. So Dan Ariely, the author of Predictably Irrational, actually had actually described this very well by describing a dilemma he had in his past. He had recently traded in a motorcycle and he was looking to buy a car to fulfill his familial responsibility. He wanted a car with more seats, basically. The problem was he didn't know exactly what kind of car he wanted, like what brand. So he went on this website and he started answering a couple questions, and the program suggested to him a sedan or a 4-door car, which has more seats compared to a motorcycle. Now, Dan didn't exactly like this suggestion because, as I said before, he's used to a motorcycle, right? The imprint of the motorcycle is on his mind, and how the driving experience of the motorcycle is so much different compared to a sedan. Because in a motorcycle, you feel the wind and the thrill and dangers of driving, but in a sedan, it's so dull and boring. So for that reason, Dan didn't like the suggestion. And so he went back, changed his answers until he got something that he liked, which was a convertible. Now, a convertible is more like a motorcycle than a sedan, right? So that's how the convertible relates more to the imprint of the motorcycle than the sedan. Keep that in mind. So what can we learn from this dilemma that he had? Well, one thing is that, judging from the fact that he didn't like the first suggestion, he knew what he wanted. He had something in his mind, and he said, well, I don't really want the sedan. I want something better, something that I'm used to, like the convertible. And therefore, since he knew what he wanted, the only reason he went on this website was to get a second opinion that backs up his choice. As I said before, that validation. So next slide, please. So how does all of this, in conclusion, how does it all boil down? So there's just one quote: happiness exists when you don't know a thing. And basically, I created this little chart here that shows the relationship between rationality and happiness. It's So as you can see, as rationality increases, happiness decreases, and vice versa. There's that inverse relationship. To tie this to Dan's dilemma, if he had chosen the sedan, which is not what he wanted due to the how you drive it and how it drives, he would have been unhappy, right? He would have been bored and the driving experience would be dull. If he had chosen the convertible, which is obviously the much more fun and therefore engaging choice, but also irrational because, as I said before, he wants a car that seats a lot of people, but the convertible can't seat anybody, while the sedan, it can't. So if he had chosen the convertible, it is the irrational choice, but he would have been more happy because of how it drives. In conclusion, the human nature is structured in such a way that what we want is usually not what is best for our situation. More often than not, we have to compromise between two different things. We have to compromise between the sedan or the convertible, as in Dan's analogy. And this compromise is by choosing a balance in this chart here that I've shown. This balance is certainly difficult to make, but through discipline and through discipline of acting rationally, we can stop acting impulsively as if Dan had bought the convertible, and we can instead act rationally, as I said before, by hypothetically buying a sedan instead of a convertible.
So how to control the impact of our anchors? A lot of these anchors have been deeply rooted into our lives for the past 5, 6, maybe even 10 years, maybe even longer. And it's going to be a pretty difficult process to completely mitigate the effects of these anchors in its entirety. Starting that process is fairly simple and easy. Start by questioning some of your daily habits. Do you really need $6 worth of coffee from Starbucks every morning? Do you actually want that coffee? Or are you just buying it because your friends are buying it? Or are you just buying it because you've been doing it for the past 2 years and you don't really have a reason? Asking yourself these simple questions is a really easy way to root out that faulty logic. And once you find faulty logic, you can easily link it back to some sort of faulty anchor you may have encountered in your life. The second aspect to that is in decisions, which are a bit more impulsive and over a longer period of time. So it can be something like buying the new iPhone every 2 years. Start weighing your options and think about whether the small difference between 2 pixels of camera quality is worth $1,200, maybe even $1,000 of your money that you spent time, effort, and just all of your energy to achieve. And when you ask yourself those questions, it's really easy to, again, root out that faulty logic. But Abdul brought up a really good point earlier, saying that some of us, we don't really want to always be completely rational. So if it brings you that small bit of like energy or happiness in the morning to spend $7 worth of coffee, and you feel like it's worth your time and energy that you spent at your job throughout the week or on whenever you work, then go ahead and buy that coffee if it helps you achieve that sort of happiness. But understand that you should come to some sort of compromise between those two factors, because if you go way too like on the end of happiness, you're gonna be way too irrational to an extent that can be detrimental to your money, yourself, your mental capacity, and all those things.
Yeah, and we learned about what behavior economics is, and we learned about the anchors or imprinting. But what Talal and Abdul had introduced you guys is how we can use this knowledge in our practical everyday life and how we can use it outside of business to improve upon ourselves. So that is very important. Now, as we're approaching an end to our class, let's ask ourselves again, what is our mission today? Is to prove wrong of traditional economics. Now, after talking about anchors and goslings and these large implications and experiments, traditional economics basically assumes that the prices of products in the market are determined by a balance between the two forces, the production, the supply, and the demand, right? I show you the graph, like the intersection of the two cross point is where the correct price is. So, but this elegant idea, it depends centrally on the assumption that the two forces are independent. As I said, they're two individual curves. And so the result of all the experiments that we demonstrated, presented in this class, challenge these assumptions. First, according to standard economic framework, consumers' willingness to pay for one of the two inputs that determine the market price, but our experiments demonstrate that what consumers are willing to pay can easily be manipulated by the design, the marketing, the imprint we give you, right? And this means that consumers don't in fact have a good handle on their preferences or the price that they're willing to pay for different goods. They make that decision based off of the impression we give them, the imprint, the anchor, and the gossip for seeing the mother. They don't have a very good idea. So that is the part where traditional economics and behavior economics conflict. That is our goal. And I think we have proven that the traditional economics theory about